Welcome back to Book Talk. Today we'll be talking about Life of Pi by Yann Martel. Life of Pi is a worldwide sensation, but to be completely honest, I'd never heard of it until the movie came out in 2012. My parents went to see it in theaters, and my dad even asked for a copy at Christmas. They told me it was about a boy in a lifeboat with a tiger, and that was it. I've still never seen the movie, but I've obviously read the book now, and it's amazing. Life of Pi is a coming-of-age story about a teenage boy named Pi who survives for months on the Pacific Ocean in a lifeboat with an adult Bengal tiger. His family owns a zoo in Pondicherry, India, but decides to sell off all the animals and immigrate to Canada. The cargo ship on which they make their journey sinks during a storm. Pi and a few other animals that were being transported on the ship are the only ones to make it out of the shipwreck alive. After a few days on the lifeboat, Pi and the Bengal tiger are the only ones remaining, and they must rely on one another to survive the dangers of the sea with what little provisions they have. I give Life of Pi 4 stars. Not only is it a harrowing story of survival, but it also has a philosophical aspect. Now, I hate philosophy as much as the next person, but in this book, it's done in such a way that it actually makes you want to read the book again to see if you missed anything. And trust me, you did. So the story actually starts with the author's note. I don't usually read author's notes because, more often than not, they're boring and have nothing to do with the actual story. I happened to read the one for Life of Pi, and I'm glad I did. I think I only read it because it was italicized, and I thought that was strange. Some of what's written in the author's note is true to life, but the rest is fictitious. I can't say for sure how much is real, but the fake parts are the ones that imply that this story could be real. He claims to meet a man named Francis Adiro-Basami, who we meet later in the narrative, that tells him the unbelievable story we're about to read, and even tells the author to get in touch with Pi Patel in Canada. It's actually a really cool idea and acts as a way to establish the main theme of the book, which is that truth is subjective. This story is from the perspective of our protagonist, Piscine Molitor Patel. Before we get into it, I feel like I should mention that every so often there are mostly short chapters that are italicized, just like the author's note. So they're supposed to be from the author's point of view and just telling us little things about Pi as he knows him, what he looks like now, that he's a good cook, stuff like that. So back to the story. We learn that Piscine Molitor was named after a swimming pool in France as a way for his father to pay tribute to his good friend and business contact, Francis Adiro-Basami. In his youth, Francis had been a champion competitive swimmer. He spent 2 years in France for school, and wouldn't you know it, he came back and the only thing he wanted to talk about was the swimming pools. Francis claimed that all the pools in Paris paled in comparison to the Piscine Molitor. It's a nice thought, but as we all know, kids can be cruel. And after one too many times of being called Pissing Patel, he decided to change it up and go by Pi when he entered a new school. The first part of this book is quite interesting but very boring, and to me it's mostly just filler and character building until we get to the real story in part 2. I'd say the only takeaway from part 1 is that Pi's father owns a zoo, so he spent his whole life around these wild animals. Then in 1977, their family sells off all the animals and boards a ship headed to Canada. Some of the animals are going with them on their journey because they were worth more money in America than India. Also, to a lesser extent, Pi has a religious discovery when he's 14, and though he was raised Hindu, he decides to follow Christianity and Islam as well because he recognizes the benefits of all three. So now to the good part. Part 2 starts with the cargo ship they're on sinking. Pi manages to get on a lifeboat before the ship sinks, and there's a funny scene where he's calling out to someone named Richard Parker, guiding him towards the lifeboat, and even throwing a lifesaver out to him. Then Pi changes his mind. He doesn't want Richard Parker in the lifeboat with him. He starts hitting him with an oar, but it doesn't deter Richard Parker, and that's when you find out that Richard Parker is, in fact, a 3-year-old adult Bengal tiger. I was so confused when I first read this part. I started wondering why he hated Richard Parker. I couldn't help but laugh when I realized it was the tiger, and even went back and read the scene again. It made it even more funny. Then Pi turned around, steps over the injured zebra in his lifeboat, and throws himself overboard. He's between a rock and a hard place. In the lifeboat is a vicious Bengal tiger, and in the water is sharks. He chose the sharks, though, obviously. Sticking the oar underneath the tarpaulin, Pi makes a sort of bowsprit, which he clings to. It keeps him out of the water and out of the lifeboat. Looking into the lifeboat, Pi realizes there was a hyena hiding under the tarpaulin and thinks that Richard Parker must have fallen into the water and drowned, because there couldn't possibly be both a tiger and a hyena on board the lifeboat. Then, floating over to the lifeboat on a bunch of bananas is their orangutan, Orange Juice. Day turns to night, and Pi can hear a ruckus coming from the lifeboat. In the morning, he's horrified to see that the hyena had attacked the zebra in the night, ripping off its broken leg and eating it. Unsatiated, the hyena attacks the zebra again. Though Orange Juice tries to stop him, she is unsuccessful, and the hyena spends most of the night eating. The zebra is still alive the next day, but eventually dies around noon. Orange Juice is furious and sets the hyena on edge. He attacks Orange Juice, and though she defends herself, the hyena still manages to kill her. Crawling on the tarpaulin to see what became of Orange Juice, Pi discovers that she'd been beheaded. He's almost certain he'll be the next to go, but then Pi spots Richard Parker's head underneath the bench and wonders how he missed a 450-pound Bengal tiger on board the boat for 2 days. The next day, Pi finds a storage unit in one of the benches that held a number of supplies, such as cans of water, emergency rations, fishing kits, a whistle, etc. There are enough supplies to last him 124 days if he rationed correctly. Later in the day, Richard Parker kills the hyena, drags his body under the tarpaulin, and starts eating him. A lot happens in those first few days, and then pretty much nothing happens for a while. Well, nothing really of note happens. Pi creates a small raft out of oars, life jackets, and the lifesaver and ties it to the bow. He spends most of his days and nights on that raft to keep away from Richard Parker, but he knows that it isn't sustainable. Most of the book is spent on Pi training Richard Parker to become somewhat, for lack of a better word, domesticated. He provides the creature with fish to eat, showing Richard Parker that he would go hungry without Pi around. And if Richard Parker does something he doesn't like trying to eat him, then Pi induces seasickness by blowing the whistle and rocking the boat side to side. After a while of doing this, Pi is able to secure his own place within the lifeboat. One day, Pi temporarily loses his sight and his marbles. This whole scene was confusing to me at the time. Pi starts having a conversation with someone about what kinds of food they wish to be eating. Pi keeps putting forward vegetarian options, while his unseen companion says all those meals would be better with meat. And it's weird things like tongue and brains. Pi comes to the conclusion that he's speaking with Richard Parker, except he realizes something and wonders, why does Richard Parker have a French accent? Then he finds out it's another castaway on a passing lifeboat who is also hungry and blind. After speaking for a while, Pi invites the man into his boat, thinking he would be a good companion to have. He is not. As soon as the man gets onto Pi's lifeboat, he wraps his hands around his throat and makes it very clear that he wants to eat him. Of course, the man doesn't know about Richard Parker and ends up dead and eaten himself. Within 2 days, Pi got his sight back, just in time to come around some weird floating island. It was entirely green, and the ground was made up of some kind of seaweed. They spend a few days on the island, Pi sleeping in a tree at night, and Richard Parker sleeping in the lifeboat. Up in the tree one night, Pi grabs what he thinks is a piece of fruit. He starts peeling the leaves off, and is horrified to find that instead of fruit, it contains a human tooth. Pi drops down to the ground from the tree, and his feet start to burn, and he discovers that when the sun sets, the island becomes carnivorous, leaving nothing of its victims but their teeth. Gotta wonder what happened to their bones. Aren't teeth just little bones? The next morning, Pi and Richard Parker leave the island for good. I'm not sure if it's supposed to be a metaphor or if it's his imagination or what. If anyone knows the answer, let me know. Anyway, after an undetermined amount of time, Pi and Richard Parker finally wash up on a beach in Mexico. Richard Parker immediately runs off into the wild and is never seen again. A few days later, Pi is visited in his hospital room by two men from the Maritime Department in the Japanese Ministry of Transport. They're hoping Pi can shed some light on what happened to make the cargo ship sink, though he has no idea. Pi recounts his story, and the men find it unbelievable. So Pi offers up another story. A story without any zoo animals. A story with a Taiwanese sailor with a broken leg, the ship's French cook, and Pi's own mother. They set the sailor's leg and kept him fed and hydrated, but his wound eventually becomes infected. The cook says they need to amputate it if they want him to live, but he really wants to use the flesh as fishing bait. The sailor dies from blood loss, and the cook cuts him up into strips, claiming it's for bait, but also eating bits and pieces as well. Pi and his mother are disgusted by the brutishness of the cook, but they need his help to survive. But one day, Pi drops a turtle they were trying to catch, and the cook hits him. His mother hits the cook in retaliation, and a violent fight ensues. When it's over, the cook throws something at Pi. He looks down to find it's his mother's head. The next day, Pi kills the cook and cuts him up and eats his flesh. Once alone, Pi turned to God for survival. The two men note the parallels between the stories. The cook was the hyena, the sailor was the zebra, Pi's mother was the orangutan, and Pi was Richard Parker. Pi points out that neither story explains the cause of the shipwreck, and neither story can be proven. But in both stories, the ship sinks, his entire family dies, and he suffers. So, he asks which story they preferred. They admitted almost immediately that they preferred the story with the animals. The story ends with a copy of the report written for the shipwreck and concludes with this. As an aside, story of sole survivor Mr. Pisin Molitor Patel, Indian citizen, is an astounding story of courage and endurance in the face of extraordinarily difficult and tragic circumstances. In the experience of this investigator, his story is unparalleled in the history of shipwrecks. Very few castaways can claim to have survived so long at sea as Mr. Patel, and none in the company of an adult Bengal tiger. There you have it. That's the story. I thought it was amazing until the end. You should have seen my face when I read about Pi's alternative story. It gave me goosebumps. And it still does. I had goosebumps the whole time saying that. I think we can all agree that the story with animals is better than the one without. Well, I hope you enjoyed my retelling of Life of Pi. Thanks for stopping by, and I'll see you next time on Book Talk.